All right, we are just about done with the IMRaD. The final 3 sections that we have to put together are the abstract, discussion, and the appendix. In this video, I will talk about best practices for each of these sections and what not to do. So some tips to avoid that are common. So the final 3 sections that we have to work on are the abstract, which typically provides a concise, informative summary of the entire paper. The discussion section, where you interpret your results, explain what everything means, and how it answers your research questions. And finally, the appendix, where you supply additional documents to help other research consider your results more carefully. So for the discussion section, I'll talk about this first because you have to write this before you write your abstract. This is where you delve into the meaning, importance, and relevance of your results. So we worked on reporting our results objectively. Now you get to insert some subjectivity into your writing. So most discussion sections will start with a really brief recap of the key results. So the findings that are most important to answering your research question. Then a couple questions you want to try to answer are, what do your results mean? So is there a way to extract meaning from our results to help us answer our question? Why do your results matter? So you can actually start talking about the implications and kind of how this might affect the world outside of your IMRaD paper. We also want to address the limitations. So what can our results not tell us? And what are some potential issues with our research? I'll talk about where to draw the line with that in a little bit. And we always want to give recommendations for future research. So this is a small section at the end of our discussion where we help other researchers think about where could we go next. Now, before we actually look at an example discussion section, I want to talk about a couple things not to do. So the first is you don't want to introduce new results. You only can discuss data that you've reported in your results section. So if you find yourself wanting to discuss and interpret something that was not reported in your results section, you got to go back and add it to your results section. Don't make inflated claims. Most of us have pretty small sample sizes. So our study can't say too much, but we can say something. So you really want to be careful not to overinterpret or speculate too much. Vocabulary becomes really important in this section. The last thing is don't undermine your research when you talk about your limitations. I know many of us are going to have a long list of limitations, potential problems with our studies. However, you want to be careful because your goal in this small section of the discussion is to strengthen your credibility, not to emphasize the weaknesses or failures. So the reason we talk about limitations is because we want researchers to see that, we are aware of potential problems. Here's how we could have solved them or should have solved them, how future researchers could solve this problem. So by acknowledging our downsides, we can actually come off as more credible. But by listing too many weaknesses or too many failures, we can actually undermine our credibility. We're going to look at a couple ways to do your discussion. There are different lengths of discussions, and depending on how many results you need to interpret to help answer your research question, your discussion could be 2 or 3 pages. It might also only be 1 page. And so there isn't a right or necessarily wrong way to do it. However, there are common features that all discussions have. So if we look at this discussion is actually quite brief. I think it's only about 1 page total. And she essentially has 1 paragraph where she summarizes the results that are most important to answering her research question. So even giving some potential implications at the end of the summary of her results and getting into the limitations, there is only 1 small paragraph where she gets into kind of the small sample size. And then finally, a couple sentences talking about what future research could go into. This is quite concise. I'm not saying you have to have a 1-page discussion, but this is one way to do it. Here is another discussion section that is relatively concise. We have a little bit of a longer paragraph summarizing the results. This student chose to take the survey results first and to kind of summarize those and interpret those connected to the research question. We can see that this suggests, so words like suggests are getting to what the student is trying to put forth to answer her question. Then she briefly brings in how the interviews also benefited the recommendation that she hopes to make. She combined her limitations and further research into one paragraph, which you can totally do, but again, does not spend a ton of time on the limitations because we don't want to undermine our credibility. Here's one final example of a discussion that is a little bit longer, almost 2 pages, but again, starts with a summary of the results and kind of breaks down the results into 2 different important observations, but then does have quite a long paragraph on limitations. I think the study had a lot of limitations, so she was trying to be concise with that, but again, addressed her limitations, and then in the end gets into future studies. So you'll notice there is a pattern. Those summary of results, interpretation, implication of results, limitations, and future studies are all in there. Length will vary depending on your own results. Once you draft your discussion section, you can now draft the very first part of your paper, which is the abstract. Typical abstract length is 1 single paragraph, usually about 150 to 300 words. This can vary depending on the journal or the academic discipline that you are writing in. But all abstracts do pretty much 3 things. 1, they give a concise, informative summary of the entire paper. So it should stand on its own. It is not part of your introduction. So consider them 2 separate pieces of writing. You can include things from throughout your paper, obviously, in the abstract, but someone should be able to read the abstract on its own and understand the main idea of your paper. Lastly, you want to preview the paper's content, and we typically do that in the order of an IMRaD. Here's an example of a pretty concise abstract. This one's about 140 words, but typically we're going to break them down into 4 things: purpose, methods, results, implication. These percentages are not set in stone, but I like to give it as a guideline for students. Most academic journals want you to limit your purpose to about 1/4 of your abstract. The method section of your abstract will take up also about 1/4. You want to spend the bulk of your abstract summarizing your results. And lastly, you will talk about the implications. Notice that we do not talk about limitations in our abstract. We don't need to admit our faults right off the bat. They can read the whole paper for that if they want to know. There are 2 common problems that students often struggle with when they're writing abstracts. The first is they provide a statement of what the paper will ask or explore rather than what it found. So we don't want to spend too much time talking about the purpose or our research question. We want to spend the bulk of our abstract actually giving results. So if you find yourself writing a sentence like this report examines the causes of oversleeping. Nobody who reads your abstract really needs to know about that. They can probably gather that from your title. What they really want to know is what are some of the causes that you found. And so here, something better to say would be individuals oversleep because they go to bed too late, forget to set their alarms, and keep their rooms dark. That is much more interesting and relevant information to someone who is scanning a lot of abstracts than what was the actual purpose of your paper. If we go back to that example I showed you, you'll notice there is just one small sentence at the top which talks about the purpose, what the paper was looking to do, and then the results section is very specific on the results showed, the results revealed, that kind of thing. The other common problem that students often have is providing general categories than specific details in the findings. So you do want to try to be as specific as possible in your abstract. So if you find yourself writing a sentence like, the study draws conclusions about which variables are most important in choosing a movie theater, that is too vague. Readers are going to want to know what variables were you actually looking at. So it would be better to say something like, the study concludes that most important variables in choosing a movie theater are comfortable seats and high quality popcorn. That gives people a lot more information to go on to decide if they want to read the rest of your paper. Okay, the last part of your paper that you have to add is the appendix section. And this is where you provide additional materials for other researchers, other people reading your IMRaD. You might include raw data, survey, observation, interview instruments, coded transcripts, and observation notes. We always want to label them, and we put each appendix on its own page. So if you have multiple appendices, you would label them Appendix A, Appendix B, Appendix C, and then each one would have its own descriptive title. Again, ideally, we are putting these on their own pages. So in this example, the student has Appendix A, survey instrument, and she provided a link to her Qualtrics survey. On the next page, we have her coded transcript 1. You can see the key is here, and she did a nice job actually giving like interview subject details, so we have that information and we can see that the transcript was coded. She included her consent forms. You don't have to. That is something that you could submit separately, especially if your interviewees wanted to remain anonymous. Appendix C is her second interview transcript, again, in here and coded. She also is providing her raw data. So we have a link to her Google Doc where we can see the survey data raw. And that is great for researchers because then they can actually see the data unmanipulated as it was in your results section. So that's it. Once you provide all of those final 3 sections, you are done writing your IMRaD. We will obviously do some revision and cleaning up the final drafts. But yeah, well done getting through this primary study.